Okay, we need to talk a little bit about inaction because we've looked at all the actions. We looked at creativity and practicality and thinking. But there's also inaction, which is really the mental processing when there's no action that's connected to it. Anyone who's had an adolescent male as a son knows about the inactive mode. Because what happens when young males get upset? 13, 14, 15 years old, they get upset, they go to their room and they slam the door, right? And then what happens once they slam that door? Either lay down or sit down and they start processing. They start thinking about what it is that's bugging them and they grind on it. They think about it over and over and over again. And it's through the thinking that they're telling the story. And actually, if they keep on thinking about it, they start to see things from a little different perspective, and they gain a little bit of detachment or understanding from just telling the story in their own brain. So this is what we're talking about. We're just talking about the interaction of inaction to process. It can happen all sorts of places. But one of the things we need to talk about is that it really does not have a very good name, because for years and years the healing ideas were thought of to be crying and talking about it. If you cried and talked about it, then you must be healing. If you're not doing those things, then something must not be working. You're not really healing. And of course, inactive, pulling back and being quiet, is not seen as a healing mode because it's the farthest thing you can get from talking about it or crying. And so it kind of has a bad name. And I don't think it deserves such a bad name, but on the other hand, there are some drawbacks to the inactive mode. And let's talk about those right now. A lot of times when we're dealing with grief, two things will come up that are difficult: shame and grief, or shame and guilt. Those two things, shame and guilt. And it's the shame and guilt that makes the grief difficult in some ways. When we go to a support group and talk to people about our shame and guilt, what happens? They're usually more forgiving about our stuff than we are. And when we hear outside feedback about this kind of thing, we tend to start to let it go in a different way. But you see, if you're only grinding, if you're only by yourself, if you're only in your own brain thinking that story and telling it over and over again, you don't get the power of this outside feedback that is a little bit kinder towards you. You only get whatever your own brain is saying, whether it's judgmental or easygoing or whatever it is. So the danger of the inactive mode is that the shame and guilt will perpetuate and keep going because you don't have an outside source to kind of bless you and to say things are okay. So that's one of the problems. The other thing is that we don't want to get this mixed up with ruminating or with OCD kinds of things, because that's a different ballgame altogether. There are pathological situations where we'll have the same thoughts repeat over and over and over and over and over again like that we can't stop. That's not quite what we're talking about. What we're talking about is in response to grief. A lot of times some of these stories will play out in our minds over and over again. That's very different from an obsessive kind of thought. And it's different too from what they're calling ruminating. So it's really natural to a grief response to have these things happen over and over again, not in an OCD kind of way, but just in a natural sort of way. One of the best examples of the inactive mode, other than the adolescent, is a man I worked with who had what he called a grief chair. And he'd go home and he'd sit in his grief chair. And once he was in his grief chair, he went straight into the inactive mode and he just started thinking about it. He started grinding on it, started letting it into his brain, into his biocomputer. And as he did that, as he let things into his brain and his biocomputer, what happened? The story starts to come up. The emotion starts to come up. He starts to tell the story, take it a little chunk at a time, and start to let go of some of that stuff in the grief chair. But this stuff can be as simple as just walking down the street. You walk down the street, and as you're walking, you're thinking about your loss. You're processing. You're letting the story be told over and over and over again. And slowly you start to let it go as the stuff comes up. So it's a way to kind of chip away. Driving in the car. A lot of people will drive, and as they're driving, they're thinking, driving, thinking, driving, thinking. And this inactive mode, again, what does it do? It kind of helps us to process over and over and over again. Tossing in bed, getting, not being able to sleep. What happens? We're probably over and over, we're thinking about this stuff. We're grinding on the grief in some ways. And this can be a positive. It can also be a negative, but it can be a positive. There's a man I know who, his wife died, and he and the wife used to always take these walks in the woods. And after she died, he took the same walk. And through that walk, he went into the inactive mode, where he started kind of processing. He started remembering his story, and in so doing, the emotions started coming up. He'd come out of the woods, and he'd stop crying. He was crying in the woods, he told me, but the neighbors never knew what was going on. They had no idea he was grieving, and that's true for a lot of masculine grief. You do not see it. You cannot see it because it's well hidden. And unless you ask the right questions, you're not going to know about it. There's another man whose daughter died, and he remembered that his closest time with his daughter was driving her to and from school. It's like that was the time in the morning when they could kind of be together and have a relationship, which they did. They would talk back and forth. After her death, he continued to talk to her in the car, just like he had before. So he's carrying on the same conversation, except it's in the inactive mode. I remember this man had a shark's tooth hanging from his rearview mirror that was a shark's tooth from her necklace, one of her favorite necklaces, and he hung it there. And as he would talk to her in the car, he'd reach over and just touch the tooth and let it go. That's the inactive mode. Processing things in an inactive way, whether you're driving, whether you're walking on the street, whether you're tossing in bed, doesn't matter. Just that you're telling the story over and over again, and as long as that story is touching off the emotions in you, that's moving you towards transformation.